May I have your attention? Welcome again to the Northwood University Freedom Seminar. My name is Dale Matchek. I'm the chair of the Econ program here at Northwood. And tonight it is my pleasure to introduce you to a person who is no stranger to the Northwood Freedom Seminar. I haven't been counting his appearances, but he's been coming here on a regular basis for a number of years, and he always provides an enlightening lecture on a public policy topic of vital interest to our future. And tonight, he is going to be talking to you about government deficits, debt, entitlements, and things that will have an important impact on your future. So I hope that you'll be paying attention and ask plenty of questions. Michael is from the Cato Institute, where he is a senior fellow. His research interests are primarily on the subject of poverty and social welfare policy, healthcare, and entitlement reform. He has written a book, The Inclusive Economy, which I highly recommend, with its emphasis on how to bring wealth to America's poor. More recently, he's been working with a project on poverty and inequality in California, which is an effort to create bipartisan solutions to the problem of poverty in California, and hopefully what works there can be tried in other places. So feel free to ask him questions about his work in California and elsewhere. But for now, I just want to ask Michael to the stage to talk about the debt that hasn't gone away. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it very much and appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. I really appreciate the opportunity to come back to Northwood. I always enjoy these trips very much. I wouldn't necessarily let that go to your head. See, you get me out of Washington, D.C., so I'm always happy to be somewhere else. That said, I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about the debt. It's actually not a topic that I've worked on for the last couple of years. They essentially stopped me from talking about it. They said if you talked about I'd come up here, I'd do these Northwood talks, I'd talk about the deficit and the debt. They'd have to take away sharp implements, your knives and stuff like that before they'd let you out of the room. So they said, okay, you can talk about it again this year, but you have to be more upbeat. You have to be more positive, glass half full type of guy about these things. So I'm going to try to do that. I'm going to see if I can be the optimist on the deficit and the debt this time around, if we can do that. So let me start off with some good news, if I can. Next year, assuming that he gets everything he wants, President Biden's budget, if you look at that, and he gets all the spending he wants, he gets all the taxes he wants for that. Next year, the budget deficit will be about $1.2 trillion. No, that really is good news. It really is, because the budget deficit was over $3 trillion last year. Now, so we've more than cut it in half. We're down, down to 1.2 trillion. It's hardly noticeable. It's a rounding error in Washington these days. In all honesty, this was a little bit of a strange period. This was, we had COVID relief package 1, 2, 6, 27, whatever they were out there. This is the disease that obviously ate money, but if you actually look at it compared to the budget deficits that we traditionally have, it's going to be up from where the budget deficits have traditionally been. But it could be worse, obviously. If we could just have another pandemic, maybe they can get it up over 4 trillion. We can try harder, something like that. Anyway, basically, I also want to make sure that we understand that the debt and the deficit, this is the deficit, which is sort of the accumulated debt. Think of it this way. People often mix up the deficit and the debt, and I like to make sure everybody understands the difference between the two. The deficit is how much we've overspent this year. The debt is how much we overspend altogether. So it's basically if you get your paycheck and you go out and you blow it all this week, well, that's your deficit. What you don't have come Friday night, that's your deficit for this week. If you do that every Friday, every week, so you have to borrow money every Friday night, well, that's your debt, and it just kind of accumulates. Now, in reality, deficits aren't the worst thing in the world. We all run deficits occasionally. I mean, every one of us has gotten to a Friday night and that party's coming up and we just don't have the money to have. I mean, that's why God invented credit cards, right? And the same thing is true for governments. Things happen. You have a war in Ukraine. You have a pandemic. You have, things happen, and sometimes you end up spending more money than you planned, and you run a deficit. And you should try to avoid doing that too much, but doing it once in a while is not the end of the world. On the other hand, if you got your budget and you do that every week, and you run that deficit every week, and that credit card gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and you can't pay it off, you're in trouble. The same thing with a country. If it runs a deficit every year and it begins to run debt, and we end up with our debt being in the area of around 30 trillion right now, it becomes a problem. In fact, that debt right now is greater than the GDP of this country, more than 100% of our GDP. We actually owe more money than all the goods and services that are produced in this country over the course of a year. So think of it this way, that your credit card bills now exceed your entire salary. At that point, you might realize you've got a bit of an issue. Let me try and put it all in perspective if we can here. This is compared to some other countries. You can see that there are countries in worse shape than us. Greece is doing worse than us, but we're better than Greece. Yay. We beat Italy. Okay. France is doing better than us. France is doing better than us. I mean, all these countries in Europe, you hear about what spendthrifts they are. Spain, Portugal, they all have less debt compared to GDP than we do. We're in worse shape than all of them. Or let me put it another way, one that you might respond to. This is student debt. Hear a lot about student debt. I know, Bernie Sanders wants to cancel it for you. I mean, we worry a lot about it. Look, and I understand, that debt you're carrying is a big burden. It's going to be a problem when you get up there. On average in this country, people carry about $32,000, almost $33,000 in debt. Every student does when they get out of college. They're going to carry that much debt. That's quite a bit. That'll take a big chunk out of your first paycheck. You have to pay that off. Total student debt in the United States is about almost $1.6 trillion in student debt. Federal debt, that $30 trillion divided up per person in the United States, your share of that debt is over $63,000 that you owe. Your share of that. That's double what you owe in student debt. And you're ultimately going to have to pay that through the taxes you pay, to reduce services that you get. That debt is eventually going to come out of money that you get in some way or another. You're either going to pay higher interest rates, you're going to pay higher taxes, or you're going to receive fewer services as that debt is paid off. But that's going to be a real cost to you. And it's double what you're facing in terms of student debt. So it's a very real obligation that you are ultimately going to face. I can't do it. I can't be positive and upbeat. I'm sorry. I've been trying to be this kind of glass half full guy. I just can't keep it up. I'm afraid I'm going to have to deliver some bad news now. Because for all the numbers that I just gave you, for all the, all that bad comparison stuff like that, that actually is the good news. Because the real debt that we have in this country is actually much, much bigger than the debt I gave you. There's actually three types of federal debt, and I want to walk you through these if I can for a little bit here. First is what's called debt held by the public. These are essentially government bonds, treasury bonds that people have, that various people have in their portfolio. If you have a retirement portfolio, you probably have the debt in there. T-bills, you see them out there. Someone goes out and buys this debt. You bought a savings bond when you were a kid. That's part of this sort of thing. And this is very real debt. I mean, this is debt that ultimately has to be paid off to somebody. Though somebody who actually has one of those, has a bond out there that they've gotten, a government bond, they come due. They mature at a certain time, and the government actually has to pay them off. Now, what it actually does is it borrows the money again and it rolls it over, type of thing. But there's someone that they actually owe this money to, so it's the most solid type of debt that there is. It's also debt that economists worry a lot about. They worry about it for a lot of reasons. One is that potentially this is debt that could squeeze out other types of borrowing, because if the government's going to borrow this money for this debt, that means there's less money available for companies to borrow that they're going to do when they want to expand a business or hire more workers or so on. So it can begin to squeeze out private sector borrowing. It's also debt that has national security implications, because other countries hold about 40% of this debt. About 10% of this debt is held by China, for example, and who, along with Japan, are the largest holder of our U.S. debt among foreign countries. So there's certainly things that go with Chinese holding a large portion of debt. What if they stop buying it? Is always a threat that they have out there. If they don't buy our debt anymore, if they don't let us roll over that debt, it can become very complicated for us. And finally, in order to get people to buy this debt, we have to pay them an interest rate. People don't buy this debt out of the goodness of their heart. They don't buy a bond unless they're getting some return on it. Now, right now, interest rates are still pretty low. And they're really low because, frankly, we're still the safest place for people to put their money. I mean, there's not a big market. The euro isn't going gangbusters, really. Nobody's buying the renminbi as an investment these days. The ruble right now is probably not your best bet. We are, frankly, the fastest horse in the glue factory. So people are, still willing to put their money in here, even if it only earns a modest rate of return. And right now we're paying about a little less than 2% in terms of interest on the debt. Traditionally, though, that interest rate has been closer to 4 or 5 or 6%. If it goes back up to those levels in the future, and we may well see that, especially if we have to deal with inflation and they begin to jack up interest rates in order to sort of suck money out of the economy to deal with inflation, we could end up where we're paying for every 1% increase in interest rates, we end up paying $100 billion more in interest payments. And the money we pay on interest is money that doesn't buy you anything. I mean, think about it with your credit card. The money you pay for the interest on that credit card doesn't get you that new flat screen TV. It's just money that goes to the bank. And the same is true with the money we pay in interest on the debt. Doesn't buy any tanks or planes if you're on the right, or doesn't pay for any social programs if you're on the left. It doesn't buy you anything. It's simply, wasted income, wasted taxes for borrowing. Second type of government debt is what's called intragovernmental debt. This is debt that one part of the government essentially owns another part of the government. You've all heard about the Social Security Trust Fund, right? That's one, essentially the Social Security Trust Fund is government owes money to the Social Security Trust Fund. Right now, the trust fund has got about $2.9 trillion in it in government bonds. This is money that the government essentially borrowed from the Social Security system. And I'll explain how that works later. But essentially, they borrowed this money and they have to pay it back in order to pay Social Security benefits. So they have to come up with $2.9 trillion to pay it back. if you want to get all the Social Security benefits as promised, they've got to do it. So this is, also kind of a hard debt that they've actually got to put together and pay. Excuse me. So they've got to come up with about $6.5 trillion to pay back these trust funds. There's a Social Security trust fund. There's a Medicare trust fund. There's actually more than 100 of these trust funds. There's a highway trust fund that's supposed to pay for roads and bridges whenever we don't do an infrastructure bill. There's a Louisiana oil spill pipe trust fund. There's trust funds for almost everything in the government. Put them all together, and we owe those trust funds about $6.5 trillion. You put that $6.5 trillion together with the $3.6 trillion in debt to the public, and you come up with the over $30 trillion that is considered the national debt. So whenever you hear news commentators or politicians talking about the national debt and it's $30 trillion, what they are talking about is a combination of intergovernmental debt and debt held by the public. Those two, add them together, and that should get your national debt out of that. But there's a third type of debt that's out there. And this is called implicit debt, or the unfunded obligations of various programs like Social Security and Medicare. So we can take a program like Social Security, and we can estimate in the future how much it's going to cost. Because we know what the law says you have to pay to every retired person in benefits. We know how many people roughly should be retired in a given year. We could do the math, come up with how many people is going to be retired. We know the benefits they're going to receive. And we can do the math on that and say, okay, this is how much we're going to have to pay 10 years from now, or 20 years from now, or 30 years from now. That's how much Social Security is going to cost. We can also do an estimate on how much tax money, the Social Security system is going to be bringing in. This is sort of a University of Michigan PowerPoint here. But we can estimate how many people will be working. We know roughly what their wages should be. We know what the tax rate is by law. And we can say, okay, you're going to bring in a certain amount of money into the Social Security system through the taxes and through that. And you're going to pay out a certain amount of money. And there's a gap between the two. We're only bringing in this amount of money, and we're paying out this amount of money. That gap is the implicit debt or the unfunded obligation of these programs like Social Security and Medicare and some others, a few others. That unfunded liability estimate comes to somewhere in the area of around $96 trillion, or maybe a little more. I mean, at that point, who cares what's $1 trillion among friends? About $42 trillion of that is Social Security. Most of what remains is Medicare. There's a little bit in terms of defense pensions and some other government civil service pensions and things of that nature that we owe that aren't funded. But essentially, most of that is the Social Security and Medicare that we on that. So if you throw those together, if you take that roughly, let's round it off to $100 trillion, plus the $30 trillion that we owe in the sort of harder debt up here in the intergovernmental debt and the debt held by the public, then the real debt that we have in this country is somewhere in the area of around $130 trillion that we owe. And by we, by the way, I mean you. I'm going to be dead. You're going to be working and paying it when I'm retired down in Boca someplace. On that. All right, so what do we do about it? Well, we could raise taxes. That's how one side figures it. You can hear this talked about a lot by, one political party says we're going to raise taxes in order to solve this problem. But of course, there's a slight problem with the fact that raising taxes is not particularly popular. So we're not going to raise taxes on you. We're going to raise taxes on the rich. And if we just make those evil rich people pay their fair share, then we can solve all this problem with Social Security and Medicare, right? If only Warren Buffett paid more taxes than his secretary, which is Bernie Sanders used to talk about all the time. He does pay more taxes than his secretary, but let's assume he doesn't. Let's raise his taxes to do that. That would solve our problems, right? Well, not really. This right here is the $30 trillion that we currently owe. Chart here. This is the $130 trillion that I just mentioned. This is the combined income of everybody in America who was in the top 1% last year. That, by the way, the top 1% isn't just billionaires. That top 1% is about $300,000 a year in terms of income. So let's throw that all in. This right here, red chart here about is the total wealth of the top 1% in America. You could take every penny they have, and of course you could only do that once. But if you somehow manage to take every penny that every millionaire and billionaire in America had, you wouldn't come close to solving the problem. All right, so raising taxes, maybe we're not going to get there that way. So let's cut spending. That's the other side. One side wants to raise taxes, the other side says, no, let's cut spending. But of course, spending is popular. So we're not going to actually cut any spending that anyone likes. Let's find things that people hate, and we'll cut that spending. So let's think of some things. What do people really dislike out there? I know. Foreign aid. There's what everybody hates, foreign aid, right? Foreign aid to everybody is 1% federal spending. All right, so foreign aid isn't going to do it by itself. We're going to have to find something else. What can we do? I know. We'll defund Planned Parenthood. And okay, that might not be enough by either. So let's get rid of the public broadcasting system, right? We'll kill Big Bird. Planned Parenthood and Big Bird combined are 1/100% of federal spending. Look, this is where money actually goes, the federal government. All non-defense discretionary spending combined is 16% federal spending. I mean, that's everything from the FDA to the FBI, the Department of Education, the Department of Commerce. You could eliminate it all. Believe me, I've had that fantasy many a night. But you could eliminate it all, and you wouldn't get there. Defense spending. 13% of the federal budget is defense spending. And we're now sort of in a proxy war where we're going to spend even more money. I mean, you look at these things, the wonderful Javelin anti-tank missiles and Stinger missiles. They're wonderful, but they're expensive. We're going to have to buy a whole bunch of them. But even if you didn't and you cut the defense budget, let's cut it in half. Not going to get there. Where's the money go? Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare. Almost half of all federal spending, just those three programs alone, those three entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. You cannot deal with the federal debt, reduce the deficit, cut federal spending, unless you are willing to deal with those three entitlement programs. By the way, let me just give a word here on entitlement, because fortunately I don't think it's going to be a problem here, but when I go out and I talk to seniors groups, they immediately jump on me to tell me how Social Security is not an entitlement because they actually paid into the system. Entitlement does not mean welfare. Entitlement is a technical term, excuse me, which simply means automatic spending. It means that it is not appropriated on an annual basis. There is no vote every year on how much to spend on Social Security. Rather, there's simply a formula that says there's this many people, every person gets this much money, you have to spend what it takes to fill the program. And it's not part of the normal appropriations process. It's not subject to the normal appropriations votes. In fact, ironically, welfare is not an entitlement. The TANF program, the welfare program, they actually have to vote on every year on how much they're going to spend on it. So that's not an entitlement, whereas Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid are. So that's all it means when I start talking about entitlement spending. So let's take a look at these three programs individually. Social Security is running a deficit. It's a small one this year. It's only about $60 billion this year that it ran in a deficit, but that's just going to grow worse with each passing year. About $7 trillion in deficits out there at about 2095 or so. It just gets worse. Now, Social Security is essentially, the best way I can describe Social Security, well, it's a Ponzi scheme. When you pay your Social Security taxes, none of the money that you put into those taxes in any way pays for your retirement. None of it's saved for you in any way. Every penny that you pay in Social Security taxes goes immediately out the door to pay for grandma's retirement. And then you hope that when you get to be retired, your kids will come along to pay for your retirement after them. Now, this works fairly well, like any pyramid scheme, for the people at the top of the pyramid. They did pretty well. In fact, the very first person who ever got Social Security benefits in America was a woman named Ida Mae Fuller of Ludlow, Vermont. Ida Mae paid $18 in Social Security taxes in her life, retired, and went on to live to be 100. Collected $38,000 in Social Security benefits. Did pretty well. People who retired long ago did terrific. And as long as you have new people coming in at the bottom of that pyramid who can continue to pay the taxes, everyone can move up the pyramid, can do pretty well. The problem is we're living longer, so there's more and more people who are retired receiving benefits. And we're having fewer babies for a lot of reasons. And that means that we're having fewer and fewer workers who are paying into the system to pay those benefits. In 1950, there were 16 workers who were paying taxes for every person who was getting retirement benefits. So you can figure what the tax rate would have to be. You could, just take the person's retirement benefits, divide by 16. That's what each person has to pay their taxes, their share of it. Today, there's 3 workers for every retiree. By the time you retire, there's going to be slightly less than 2. I've already got my eye on a movie star and a basketball player. Fine. But you can see how if you do the math, how that tax burden is just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger on you until the whole Ponzi scheme ultimately collapses. Okay, but we've got what about the Social Security Trust Fund? Won't that solve the problem? Remember I mentioned that earlier. There's that $3 trillion that is sitting in that trust fund. And there's there's a lot of confusion about what the trust fund is. You get a lot of food fights in Washington over it. One side tell you, the trust fund is as good as gold. The other side will tell you the trust funds have been looted. None of that is actually true. The trust fund is simply, until about 1983 or so, until about 4 or 5 years ago, Social Security ran a surplus. That is, it took in more money in taxes than it was paying out in benefits. Not a lot, but some. And that money has to go somewhere. They can't just put it in a cigar box and bury it out behind the Treasury bar. So what they do is they buy a special issue government bond with it. Not a tradable bond. It's not like a T-bill that you go out and get. It's a special issue bond. And that bond is then held by the Social Security Administration. And the money that bought that bond is then general revenue of the federal government. It's spent on whatever the federal government might spend money on. Infrastructure Week, fighting in Ukraine, building the Cowgirl Hall of Fame. But whatever it is, that's where that money went. And it's spent and it's gone. What remains behind is these bonds. And at that point, the federal government, at some point, the federal government, when it's running its deficit here, has to go back and take those bonds out and pay them back. So the Social Security has money to pay the benefits. Only the federal government doesn't have any money. They're running a $1.2 trillion deficit. Apologies. So where are they going to get that money? They're going to raise taxes. They're going to borrow it. Or they're going to cut spending somewhere else in the budget and move. No, never mind. Essentially, they're going to borrow that money and just run up the debt in order to pay it off. If we didn't have a Social Security trust fund at all, imagine what would happen when we started running that deficit. If the government wanted to continue to pay Social Security benefits, it would have to find $60 trillion this year, $60 billion this year. Where's it going to get that money? It would have to raise taxes, borrow it, or not forget it. It would be exactly the same set of choices as if the trust fund didn't exist. The trust fund is nothing more than an accounting entry of how much money the federal government, which doesn't have any money, owes the Social Security system if it wants to pay any benefits that are coming forward. That is why I'll let you in on a simple clue. Simple fact. Social Security cannot pay you the benefits that it has promised you, given the level of taxes that we currently have. There is no way that unless we find some additional revenue someplace, Social Security will be able to pay you the benefits that are promised to you. That's not to say you won't get anything. As long as some money is coming into the system, it will be able to pay some benefits. But it won't be able to pay this amount of benefits. That will not be there for you. And as bad as Social Security is, Medicare is in worse shape. And this is another one. It's very simple math here. Medicare is another sort of Ponzi scheme. People pay in, at least a part of the system. Part of the system gets funded through general revenues. They pay into the system in taxes. They take out the same demographics that's going on, the same lack of workers, a lot more retirees living a lot longer, collecting a lot more health benefits, a lot more. They're spending their Medicare money. Fewer and fewer workers paying into the system to support them. The average worker pays about $161,000 in Medicare taxes over the course of their lifetime. When you get that, that Medicare tax out of your paycheck in your life, it'll add up to about $161,000, which is very real money. You're paying a lot of Medicare taxes in life. The average retiree will collect $522,000 in Medicare benefits over the course of their lifetime. $161,000 in, $522,000 out. Doesn't work. Let me give you another example of how this works. In 2010, there were 48 million, just under 48 million people on Medicare. And we spent about $12,000 for every one of them, every year. This is on an annual basis. In 2020, that had increased to 64 million people on Medicare, and we were spending about $16,000 per year for every one of them. By 2030, there's going to be 81 million people on Medicare, And we're going to spend almost over give it take $24,000 on each of them. We're essentially losing money on every transaction and trying to make up for it in volume. This is math that's simply not going to work. Finally, I want to throw in here Medicaid. Because Medicaid, we tend to think of as Medicaid as a program for the poor, and in many ways it is. But the reality is, Medicaid is simply another program for senior citizens at your expense. If we look at who's on Medicaid, the majority of people on Medicaid are children, young adults, essentially. These are people who are living in poverty. So the majority of people who receive Medicaid are welfare recipients. They are the people you traditionally associate with Medicaid. But that's not where the money goes. If you want to see where the money goes, it's over here. The aged and the disabled who collect the money, there are overlapping categories there. Essentially, that's old people in nursing homes. That's where Medicaid spends its money. In fact, there's entire industries out there that are dedicated to how you can get people to spend down their money so that they then for Medicaid to pay their nursing home bills. How they can leave their house to their kids and then have the taxpayers have you pay for their nursing home bill, things of that nature. There's entire law firms that's all they do on that sort of thing. And Medicaid's running into the same thing again as all these others. You can see the number of enrollments going up. The cost of health care is going up along with it. Another program. This one doesn't actually run unfunded liabilities because it's actually funded directly out of general revenues. But it's another program that you're going to have to pay for as the population ages. Essentially, we have been having a great old party, and we're sticking you with the bill. So what do we do? I'm going to open up the question and answers pretty soon, and then we can talk a little bit about some possible solutions for some of these things. There aren't any easy ones. There are no easy solutions to this that are going to fix this. Any way we look at it, you're going to end up paying more, getting less. But I'm telling you, doing nothing's not an option. You saw the size of that debt. Ultimately, that's something that we can't let just drag on. You're going to end up having to pay it one way or another. And the longer we wait, the worse it becomes. The more difficult it becomes to make a transition to anything new, the more we already owe. I mean, think of it again. Go back to the analogy I've been using of your credit card. You can't do much about the debt you've run up already. But for God's sake, stop charging. Every year that we go out with the U.S. credit card, government credit card, and we go out and we run that debt higher, that just postpones the reckoning that's going to come. And that reckoning is coming, whether we like it or not. I hope they took away all the sharp implements at any rate. I'm happy to take your questions on this or anything else you'd like to talk about. So thank you very much. My apologies, allergies are terrible today.
Is it meant to instill panic? Are you like Greta Thunberg? Do you want them to panic?
Yes. Because they don't ask the tough questions. They let the politicians come in and lie to them. They don't push politicians on these issues. And I understand there's so many more issues out there. We discount the future. We discount whether or not, the Social Security is going to be there or what I'm going to have to pay in the future. So politicians come in and they say, I'm running for office. I'm going to promise you this. I'm going to cut your student debt. I'm going to do all these wonderful things. Do we ask them, well, how are you going to fix entitlement spending? Seniors ask them, and if they say anything about it, the seniors jump on them for it. In fact, seniors actually vote. Here's one for you. The likelihood of your voting is roughly the equivalent of your age. About 70% of 70-year-olds vote. About 30% of 30-year-olds vote. And it's pretty much a straight line, and it goes down from there. That's what faces you. If you don't get in these politicians' faces, if you don't ask them questions, if you don't vote based on these issues. So yeah, I want these folks to panic. I want the next time, who's the congressman from this district? Next time John Molyneux comes down here and says, hey, I've got this things all figured out for you, everything's going to be great. I want someone asking him, what are you going to do about Social Security? What are you going to do about Medicare? How are you going to fix the national debt? And don't tell me you're going to cut Planned Parenthood and kill Big Bird and cut off foreign aid. Don't tell me you're going to raise taxes on Warren Buffett, because that's not true. Everybody's so depressed they can't come up with a question here.
And you're going to be screwed when you grow up because Social Security is done. Like it's going to be out the window shortly. This isn't anything new for me. So I'm not surprised by a lot of these numbers. They make sense, but I don't know. I guess I want to see what you have to say. What do you think is the future, solution-wise? Like what's something we should be thinking about on this topic?
Yeah, I think this is not rocket science when it comes to solutions. I think if you have more money going out than you have coming in, you've only got a couple of choices. You can bring in more money. That's the raising taxes portion. You can send out less money. That's cut spending. And by cut spending, I don't mean Planned Parenthood. I mean cut benefits of Social Security and Medicare. Or the third option is you can try to take the money you have in the system and make better use of it. And for that, excuse me, I would suggest that maybe what we can do is invest that privately into things that return an actual return on your investment, where it puts it into the economy and actually grows. So I favor the idea of allowing you to take at least some of your Social Security taxes and invest that privately through personal accounts. Now, that would have been easier 15, 20 years ago when I started talking about this, because we didn't have $30 trillion in debt then. And there is a sort of a transition issue that goes on with this. Because frankly, if I let you take some of your money and invest it privately, grandma doesn't get that money anymore. So I've got to pay, you basically going to have to pay grandma and yourself at the same time. So you're screwed no matter what. But the higher rate of return that we earn on U.S. private capital, return on investment's been about 8% real since the turn of the last century. So through the Great Recession, through Great Recession, the various wars, various ups and downs in the market, what have you, you stretch it out over a lengthy period of time, you substantially make better money from that than you would get from Social Security, where you're actually going to get a negative return on your investment. So I think that's an alternative, and do it on a voluntary basis. I don't think people have to be forced with this. Look, if somebody wants to, they're genetically socialist or something, and they want to stay with Social Security and take a chance on that, they'll get whatever Social Security could pay. Well, then they should be able to do that. But anybody who wants to take a portion of their money and put that in a personal account, they should be able to do that too. So let's give people a choice. I think on that. Yeah.
Medicare and Medicaid. What about the idea of price controls on drugs and medical care, which is being proposed and getting a lot of support even in today's Congress?
Yeah, this is sort of the pink unicorn theory of how we're going to save money on healthcare. We're going to let government negotiate prices with the drug companies that's going to save money on drugs. Problem is, the government has absolutely no leverage whatsoever in these negotiations. So as far as I'm concerned, let them negotiate. It won't change a thing. Because they go to the company and they say, we want you to cut your prices by 30%. The company says, no. What's Medicare going to do? Well, we won't sell your drug to senior citizens anymore. Yeah, let's see how long that lasts. Senior citizens are really going to say, oh, fine with me. I don't get my heart drug anymore. No, they're going to, the drug company's going to say no. The government's going to say, well, I tried. The prices are going to stay the same. So that's not going to get anywhere. In the end, the answer is to say no. Or the government's going to say, no, we're not going to sell that drug anymore. I mean, that's what the VA does that, for example, and they do lower drug costs. They also, on average, people die about 8 months earlier in the VA than they do in the Medicare system because they don't get the most modern drugs. They don't. The formularies are too rigid to be able to adapt quickly, and so on. People are not getting the best drugs in the system, that sort of thing. But we're ultimately in healthcare. The answer is ultimately say no. And I talk a lot about, or people talk a lot about rationing healthcare. And they say if we have socialized medicine, we'll ration healthcare. Truth is, every system in the world rations healthcare. You ration healthcare. Cuba rations healthcare. Sweden rations healthcare. Everybody does it. And the answer is because there's sort of an unlimited demand for healthcare. We all want to live forever. And if someone else is going to pay that cost, we're going to do it. Here's a thought experiment for you on healthcare. Suppose that every year, every single American got a physical. And as part of that physical, you got a CT brain scan. We would save a couple of dozen lives every year by catching brain cancers early enough to save those people's lives. And every life is priceless, right? But of course, if we did that, a physical every year and a CT brain scan was part of that physical, we'd bankrupt the country overnight. It costs about $1,000 a pop for a CT brain scan. So no country in the world gives a physical to every citizen with a brain scan involved. Nobody does it. They all ration those brain scans. They do it somehow. One of three ways, basically. You could ration by fiat, which simply is the government says, you might want a brain scan, but you can't have one. We don't allow brain scans without certain criteria being met. Nobody can have one. We think that money, that $1,000, would be much better used on providing infant formula or something. Might be right, they might be wrong, but they've made that decision democratically. They're going to do it. Or you can ration by Q. That's essentially what Canada does. You can have all the brain scans you want. Absolutely no limit to them. Of course, we've only got one CT scanner in the province of Saskatchewan, so therefore you might have a little wait for it. But once you get through that wait, you can have it. Or you can ration by price, which is what we do. We say it costs $1,000 for that brain scan. If you got $1,000 and you can pay it, you can have that CT scan. If you don't have $1,000, you're out of luck. Now, there's some advantages and some disadvantages, obviously. I kind of like price rationing because I can find a way to get you the $1,000. If it's fiat rationing or Q rationing, it's much harder to circumvent. And it also allows me, a more of a choice in the matter. For example, maybe, look, your chances of actually having brain cancer are infinitesimally small, right? But maybe your father died of brain cancer. Your uncle died of brain cancer. And you just sleep a lot better at night knowing you didn't have it. So maybe for you, it's worth $1,000. Get that CT scan just to find out you don't have brain cancer and you can relax. Well, price rationing lets you make that decision, that choice for yourself about how much it's worth to you, whether it's worth that $1,000 or not. So I tend to like price rationing as the answer. But there actually is not a right answer to that question. It's not that price rationing is always the right answer and fiat rationing is always wrong and Q rationing is something else. That's a moral and political decision that ultimately societies have to work out. What isn't an option, however, is no rationing at all. We're going to give everybody everything in the world. All experimental treatments, dental care, vision care, every drug that's ever been imagined, you name it, we're going to give it to them. The Bernie Sanders plan, which is why it costs $30 trillion. Because nobody in the world actually does that. Yeah. Greece, a few years back. No, there have been defaults out there. You can see Argentina's done it. Greece basically did it. Things like that. We're in a different shape than a lot of those countries. Number one is we control our own currency. We're not in hock to the German central bank the way a lot of these folks are. We're in hock to our own central bank. Essentially, what happens at that point is probably the bond market collapses. We default on a certain amount of the debt, and we see major depression, major slowdowns in economic growth. What you actually end up getting is before that point, you start seeing economic growth slow. In fact, as the debt increases, there's already an overhang that tends to slow economic growth. It's estimated that in your lifetime, you'll be probably about $20,000 poorer now over the course of your lifetime than you would be if we didn't run this debt, because you're already seeing the overhang over it. It's just going to come in, and partly it depends on whether we can, the plane's coming in for a landing. Partly it depends on whether or not we can kind of come in into a gliding path down it, whether we come in somewhat more steeply. How bad that recession is and how long it lasts, whether it tips over into real depression. But basically, economic growth, the bond market collapses, and that leads to all sorts of complications. You can look at sort of what happened with the housing crunch, the banks that went under that. Just multiply that through. Now, when that's going to happen, I was going to say, I don't want to predict when that's going to happen. It turns out the U.S. economy is much more resilient than people believed. I used to for years say we're 5 years away, 10 years away. We're still going. So, but you can't, that which cannot go on forever eventually stops. And we're going to end up in that situation. Yeah.
Yeah, some countries in Europe keep their national debt low. What are they doing differently than the United States? And can America take an example of those countries?
A lot of them made in some surprising cases, they made some very big decisions to cut spending out there. Sweden was a particular success case in this regard. People point to the Nordic countries as sort of these social democracies and stuff like that. A lot of that is sort of nostalgia for these countries as they were 15, 20 years ago. Sweden, for example, throughout the post-war years, at one point, Sweden had one of the fastest growing economies in Europe. They got to a point where the government was spending about 70% of GDP, and their economy stopped growing. They dramatically reduced the spending. Now, they still spend more than we do. They spend almost 50% of GDP on it. But for them, that was a huge cut. That they even partially privatized their pension system. Their Social Security system is partially privatized. They introduced more choice into their and options into their Medicare, their national health care scheme. So they did a lot of things that do market-oriented. They're also sort of a small, homogenous country that's much easier to do things with than something as large and diverse as the biggest population as the United States goes. So they were able to do a lot of those sorts of things with that. Yeah, the other thing that they did is basically the Germans basically imposed austerity on a lot of these countries and forced them. Italy, Portugal, Greece. I mean, that's one of the advantages of being in hock to the German central bank is the German central bank can make you do a lot of things, and basically force them to raise taxes and cut benefits.
What would? Oh, I love your optimism and your cheerfulness. Compare what would happen if we applied normal standards of like accounting and like fraud, like financial laws to the federal government versus what would happen if a private company were held to the same standards as the government.
Well, if you were on the board of a private company and you kept books like the federal government, you'd be in jail. I mean, literally, it's against the law to do this with your pension benefits and your health care benefits in a private company. We do not do that kind of accounting. The government's the only place that actually gets away with this. Yeah. Well, okay, yeah. I got time for a couple more.
Yeah, kind of going off that, I was curious if one of the solutions would be to privatize these entitlement funds, make them, like you said, choice, not just, hey, you have to pay this tax, maybe something you can opt in, and it would seem that government would then have to take a step back from being in our lives so much. That would be a step towards definitely like limit government. We privatize more of these large spending.
Yeah, well, particularly Social Security. I mean, it's tougher. Medicare is a little bit tougher because you're dealing with people who, by being bent of being retired, don't have the income. It's tougher to insure. I mean, basically, medical health insurance is a problem with people who are going to be sick. So how do you basically the only way you can get them to do something that's affordable is to have younger, healthy people subsidize them, which is what the Affordable Care Act tried to do. You're just extending that into the really sick people with Medicare. Social Security, however, the privatization of it would get government out of our lives in a lot of ways. It would also do a number of other important things. The current Social Security system, and I just went through the debt stuff here. The current Social Security system is unfair to people in all sorts of ways. For example, it penalizes African Americans. Because basically how much Social Security benefit gets depends on how long you live. If you live to be 100, like Ida Mae Fuller, you get a lot of Social Security checks. Die at 66, you're out of luck. Well, at every age and at every income level, African Americans have a shorter life expectancy than whites. Now, a lot of reasons for that. But it's just fact of life, that's the way it is right now. And about 1 out of every 3 African American men will pay Social Security taxes, die before they can collect Social Security benefits. Remarkably unfair. The same sort of happens actually with men and women. Men die earlier than women. Women will collect a lot more Social Security benefits than men. The poor die earlier than wealthy people. Essentially, Social Security system under which poor black men work to support rich white women. Don't think that's the system we'd set out today to invent if we were setting this up. Social Security also penalizes women who work outside the home. There's something called the dual entitlement rule of Social Security. And the way this works, and I should say the law is actually gender neutral. So, but I'm going to use men and women here because the way earning patterns are in the United States, that it just breaks down with men and women. But the law actually says spouse, to be specific. When a man dies, when the husband dies, the wife automatically receives 50% of her husband's Social Security benefits, regardless of what she earned in benefits herself. She gets 50% of her husband's benefits. Now, if you take a woman who, on the other hand, who takes a job, goes to work, pays Social Security taxes, but then has kids, takes time off for the kids, so she's out of work for a few years while she's raising the kids. Then she goes back part-time, and because women don't earn traditionally as much as men for a lot of reasons, she only earns half of her husband's Social Security benefits. She gets exactly the same 50% of her husband's benefits when he dies as if she never worked a day and never paid any penny money in Social Security taxes. All the money that she paid in Social Security taxes are simply gone. She doesn't get anything in exchange for them. And finally, it penalizes low-income people and poor people because it's the only retirement benefits they have, and it's not really there. I always take the case, take a single mother working a couple of jobs, trying to make ends meet. She's paying 12.5% of her income in Social Security taxes every year. And at 64, she dies. Her kids are over the age of 18, so they don't get survivors benefits. So what happens? All that money, that 12.5% that she paid in her whole life into Social Security, gone. None of that goes to her kids that they can use to go to college or to start a small business or to do anything like that. That's just gone. Whereas with personal accounts, that money would belong to them. It would be part of the estate. It would go to the kids. They could do what they wanted with it. It's a much fairer system. One more question. Going once. Yeah.
What is the government security if it does get privatized?
What does the government look like?
Yeah, like what happens with all the money that's already in the Social Security now?
Well, right now, all there is debt in the Social Security system. There's the $3 trillion we owe them. Essentially, there's always going to be a certain transition. Nobody's going to cut off grandma tomorrow. So we're going to pay use that. We're going to have to go through the process to find that $3 trillion in order to pay grandma no matter what. What we're going to do is that 30 or 40 years down the road, Social Security won't be there anymore, and we won't have to pay that Social Security tax into the system anymore. So you immediately get a tax cut of 12.5% of your income, or at least your kids will. As I said, you're screwed. You're going to pay for both. Thank you all very much. Really appreciate it.
All right. Another enlightening presentation by Michael Tanner. Thank you very much. And I want to thank you for being here tonight. I want to tell you a little bit about tomorrow's events. Today we focused on economic issues, and tomorrow the focus moves to environment. So we've got Jason Hayes here from the Mackinac Center for Public Policy, and he's actually going to provide 2 lectures for us. First one on free market environmentalism is at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, and then he's going to come back at 1 o'clock and give us 7 principles of sound energy policy. But at 10:30 tomorrow, we're going to have a panel discussion where 3 Northwood alums who have become leaders in business, one owner-entrepreneur, another sustainability officer, and a third one who's executive director of a major sports tournament here for the LPGA, all Northwood alums. And sustainability is an important part of their organization's business strategy. So they're going to talk about how sustainability is worked into their business strategy. So that's at 10:30 tomorrow. And so whether it's for credit or for personal interest, I hope you'll take advantage of that. And as I said earlier, tomorrow night, 7:30, Derek Kaufman, an automotive industry analyst, is going to talk about the future of the car as it relates to sustainability. So big day tomorrow. I hope to see many of you here, and have a good night, everybody.